I took a sip of my coffee, maintaining an expression of utter calm. "Oh, your car? It got towed." Karen's jaw dropped. "You stole my car." I raised an eyebrow. "No, Karen, I had an illegally parked vehicle removed from my private property. Big difference." "You had no right," she bellowed. "You should have told me first." I crossed my arms. "Karen, I warned you, repeatedly. You ignored me. The police even warned you. You ignored them too. What exactly did you expect?" Karen, clearly out of rational arguments, resorted to shouting insults and making threats. "I'm calling the police. You're going to pay for this." I didn't even flinch. "Go ahead," I said, waving my hand dismissively. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled up, and two officers stepped out. Karen ran up to them dramatically, playing the victim. "He stole my car. He had it towed without my permission," she cried. The officers turned to me, and I handed them a folder with all my documentation: ownership papers, security footage, past police reports, and a copy of the warning she had received from the police previously. The officers took a few minutes to go through the material while Karen stood there, arms crossed, waiting for them to take her side. Instead, one officer sighed and turned to her. "Ma'am, he's well within his legal rights. This is private property. You were warned multiple times. You ignored those warnings. That means your vehicle was trespassing." Karen's face turned even redder. "But I live next door," she argued, as if that somehow granted her the right to use my property as her personal parking lot. "That doesn't matter," the officer replied. "Private property laws still apply." Karen was stunned. "I suggest you go pick up your car from the impound lot," the officer continued. "You'll have to pay the towing and storage fees." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I'm not paying for this. He should pay for it," she shouted, pointing at me. The officer gave her a hard stare. "No, ma'am, you're responsible for your own actions. You parked on his property. You pay the consequences." It was at that moment that Karen realized she had lost. Completely. There was no loophole, no excuse, no one to back her up. Still, she tried to argue. "This isn't fair. I always park there. He never had a problem before." I let out a laugh. "Are you serious, Karen? I've told you countless times to stop. You just didn't care." Karen shot me a murderous glare before stomping off, still grumbling about calling a lawyer. I knew she wouldn't, though. Any lawyer would tell her exactly what the police just had. She had no case. Later that evening, I saw her return home with her car. The whole ordeal had cost her over $350 in towing and impound fees, and she had no one to blame but herself. Karen's reputation in the neighborhood took a major hit. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and her previous supporters, if there were any, vanished. She became the subject of hushed whispers and judgmental glances. She tried to regain control by complaining to local officials, but to her dismay, the HOA and city officials dismissed her complaints, siding with me. Without any support, Karen began to realize that her entitled antics wouldn't be tolerated anymore. Desperate to assert herself, she attempted small retaliations, passive-aggressive notes, dirty looks, and spreading gossip. But no one took her seriously anymore. Her influence in the neighborhood crumbled. The best part? Other neighbors started reinforcing their property boundaries too. Inspired by what had happened, some installed new fences, security cameras, and no trespassing signs. It was as if the entire community had silently agreed. Karen's reign of entitlement was over. Defeated and humiliated, Karen eventually avoided me altogether. She stopped making eye contact, refused to engage in neighborhood events, and even changed her usual walking route to avoid passing my house. The final nail in the coffin was the community's growing strength against entitled behavior. Karen had lost. As weeks turned into months, Karen's presence dwindled. The quiet relief in the neighborhood was palpable, as if an oppressive cloud had finally lifted. People began gathering more often, sharing laughs in driveways that were now respected as personal property. The collective lesson learned from Karen's downfall was simple, yet profound. Entitlement has consequences, and community strength can dismantle even the most stubborn of bullies. Life in the neighborhood returned to normal, but with one major improvement. Karen no longer treated my driveway or anyone else's as her personal property. The takeaway? Standing up for property rights isn't just about maintaining boundaries, it's about sending a message that respect is not optional. The entire ordeal had been exhausting, but in the end, justice had been served. Later that evening, I saw her return home with her car. The whole ordeal had cost her over $350 in towing and impound fees, and she had no one to blame but herself. Karen's reputation in the neighborhood took a major hit. Word spread quickly about what had happened, and her previous supporters, if there were any, vanished. She became the subject of hushed whispers and judgmental glances. I didn't even bother knocking on her door. I immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they didn't hesitate. Blocking someone's driveway was an actual parking violation, and she was ticketed on the spot. Not only that, but her car was towed again. She came running out of her house as her car was being loaded onto the tow truck, screaming about how I was harassing her. But this time, the officers weren't having any of it. With my security footage and the history of complaints, they informed her that if she continued to target me with her antics, she could be facing serious charges. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw something different in Karen's expression. Fear. That was the moment Karen finally realized that there were real consequences to her actions. She stopped parking near my property after that. She didn't apologize. She was far too prideful for that, but she finally backed down. The neighborhood also began pushing back against her behavior. The other residents, inspired by my willingness to stand up to her, started reporting her whenever she tried her old tactics on them. Slowly but surely, Karen's reign of petty neighborhood tyranny began to crumble. While I wish I could say she completely changed her ways, the truth is, some people never truly change. But she did learn one important lesson. Some boundaries can't be crossed without consequences. And the best part? This wasn't even the end of Karen's downfall. Because what happened next? Well, let's just say she had an even harder lesson to learn. By the time Karen had her car towed for the second time, I had enough of her antics. While she had finally stopped physically parking in my driveway, her passive-aggressive behavior didn't cease. The constant parking near my driveway, the smug glares, the subtle attempts to make my life difficult, it was clear she was still trying to establish dominance. However, my patience had run dry, and I knew it was time to take a stronger, more permanent action. I was done playing this petty game with her. If she wouldn't respect my property through common decency, I would make sure she had no choice but to obey the law. I started by reaching out to a local attorney who specialized in property disputes and neighborhood conflicts. I explained the entire situation, showing him the extensive documentation I had gathered, security footage, time-stamped photographs, a record of her repeated infractions, and even the official police reports from the multiple complaints and towing incidents. After reviewing everything, the attorney agreed that Karen's repeated behavior was not just an inconvenience, but a violation of my property rights. He advised me on the best course of action, filing a formal complaint against her with the city and pursuing a restraining order that would legally prevent her from interfering with my property. While a restraining order seemed extreme, he assured me that repeated harassment, even in the form of nuisance parking and intimidation, could be grounds for legal action. He also suggested filing a civil suit for trespassing and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The next step was to file the complaint with the city. Since Karen's actions were not just an isolated incident, but part of a long-standing pattern of harassment, I included every piece of evidence I had. I detailed every incident, from the first time she parked in my driveway to the final straw when she blocked my entrance and had her car towed. The city took my complaint seriously, especially since the police had already been involved multiple times. A few days later, I received confirmation that the city was opening an official case regarding Karen's behavior. If she continued violating my property rights, she could face heavy fines and, if she persisted, even legal consequences beyond simple tickets. When Karen received the notice of my complaint, she reacted as expected, outrage. She stormed over to my house once again, banging on my door, demanding to know why I was trying to ruin her life. I didn't even bother engaging with her this time. I simply told her that everything was being handled legally now and that if she didn't stop, things would only get worse for her. she refused to accept that she was in the wrong. Instead, she went around the neighborhood, spreading false claims that I was bullying her, that I was trying to get her arrested over something as trivial as parking. However, the neighborhood had already seen her behavior for what it was. Several of my neighbors stepped up and backed me, telling her off when she tried to rally them to her side. It was clear that her tactics were no longer working. While the city processed my complaint, my attorney also helped me file a request for a no-contact order, which would prevent Karen from interacting with me or interfering with my property. This was a crucial step in ensuring that she could no longer harass me, whether through direct confrontation or passive-aggressive tactics. When Karen received notice of the request for a no-contact order, her reaction was predictably explosive. She began leaving notes on my door, accusing me of being vindictive and trying to destroy her life. I documented every single note and forwarded them to my attorney. These messages only strengthened my case, as they further demonstrated her continued harassment. A court date was set to review my request, and in the weeks leading up to it, Karen became noticeably more reserved. She no longer parked near my house. She no longer tried to engage with me. It was clear that the reality of legal consequences was finally sinking in for her. On the day of the court hearing, I arrived with my attorney, fully prepared with all of my documentation. Karen, on the other hand, arrived alone, looking far less confident than she had in previous interactions. When the judge reviewed the evidence, video footage, the police reports, the city complaint, and even the threatening notes she had left on my door, it became evident that Karen had engaged in a pattern of harassment. The ruling was in my favor. The judge approved the no-contact order, legally barring Karen from interfering with me or my property in any way. If she so much as stepped onto my driveway again, she could face legal consequences far more severe than a parking ticket or a towing fee. After the court ruling, the change in Karen was almost immediate. She avoided me entirely, refusing to even make eye contact if we happened to pass each other in the neighborhood. The constant tension that had plagued my daily life finally lifted, and I could once again enjoy my own property without the fear of waking up to find her car parked in my driveway. But the most surprising part? The neighborhood dynamic changed as well. Other neighbors, inspired by my legal victory, began taking a stand against Karen's entitled behavior. Some who had previously tolerated her antics now felt emboldened to push back when she tried her usual tactics. Slowly but surely, Karen's reign of entitlement in the neighborhood began to crumble. She was no longer the neighborhood menace, no longer the woman who could get away with anything just because she threw a fit. The power she once held over everyone with her manipulative, selfish behavior was completely gone. While I would have preferred to never deal with this situation in the first place, I walked away from the experience with a newfound appreciation for standing my ground. Some people will push as far as they are allowed to, and the only way to deal with them is to enforce boundaries with real consequences. Karen learned the hard way that entitlement doesn't trump the law. And in the end, the battle was worth it, not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had suffered from her selfishness. But little did I know, Karen's downfall wasn't over yet. Because what happened next? Let's just say she wasn't quite done making terrible decisions. Karen's audacity knew no bounds. Despite countless warnings, discussions, and even the involvement of the police, she continued to treat my driveway as if it were her personal parking space. At this point, I had exhausted all polite solutions. She had ignored the security cameras, laughed at the no parking sign, and disregarded every confrontation and legal warning. Enough was enough. One crisp morning, I stepped outside with my coffee, only to find Karen's car sitting in my driveway once again. My patience had run out. I had been documenting every incident meticulously, ensuring that I had all the proof necessary to take the next step. This time, I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to hit her where it hurt. Her wallet. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and called a local tow company. I provided them with my property ownership documents and security footage, confirming that Karen had no permission to park there. The dispatcher assured me that a truck would be there within 30 minutes. I could hardly wait. As I stood at my window, watching the tow truck pull up, I felt a strange sense of justice. The driver took one look at the situation, shook his head knowingly, and got to work. Within minutes, Karen's car was hitched up and being pulled away. I could only imagine her reaction when she found out, and I didn't have to wait long. About an hour later, I heard a furious pounding on my front door. I knew exactly who it was before I even opened it. There stood Karen, her face flushed with anger, eyes blazing, fists clenched at her sides. "Where is my car?" she shrieked, her voice echoing down the street. I took a sip of my coffee, maintaining an expression of utter calm. "Oh, your car? It got towed." Karen's jaw dropped. "You stole my car." I raised an eyebrow. "No, Karen. I had an illegally parked vehicle removed from my private property. Big difference." "You had no right," she bellowed. "You should have told me first." I crossed my arms. "Karen, I warned you, repeatedly. You ignored me. The police even warned you. You ignored them too. What exactly did you expect?" Karen, clearly out of rational arguments, resorted to shouting insults and making threats. "I'm calling the police. You're going to pay for this." I didn't even flinch. "Go ahead," I said, waving my hand dismissively. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. Karen ran up to them dramatically, playing the victim. "He stole my car. He had it towed without my permission," she cried. The officers turned to me, and I handed them a folder with all my documentation, ownership papers, security footage, past police reports, and a copy of the warning she had received from the police previously. The officers took a few minutes to go through the material while Karen stood there, arms crossed, waiting for them to take her side. Instead, one officer sighed and turned to her. "Ma'am, he's well within his legal rights. This is private property. You were warned multiple times. You ignored those warnings. That means your vehicle was trespassing." Karen's face turned even redder. "But I live next door," she argued, as if that somehow granted her the right to use my property as her personal parking lot. "That doesn't matter," the officer replied. "Private property laws still apply." Karen was stunned. "I suggest you go pick up your car from the impound lot," the officer continued. "You'll have to pay the towing and storage fees." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I'm not paying for this. He should pay for it," she shouted, pointing at me. The officer gave her a hard stare. "No, ma'am. You're responsible for your own actions. You parked on his property. You pay the consequences." It was at that moment that Karen realized she had lost. Completely. There was no loophole, no excuse, no one to back her up. Still, she tried to argue. "This isn't fair. I always park there. He never had a problem before." I let out a laugh. "Are you serious, Karen? I've told you countless times to stop. You just didn't care." Karen shot me a murderous glare before stomping off, still grumbling about calling a lawyer. I knew she wouldn't, though. Any lawyer would tell her exactly what the police just had. She had no case. Later that evening, I saw her return home with her car. The whole ordeal had cost her over $350 in towing and impound fees, and she had no one to blame but herself. The incident quickly spread around the neighborhood. People who had been silently suffering from Karen's entitled behavior were overjoyed that someone had finally stood up to her. I got more than a few nods of approval from my neighbors, and one even came over to shake my hand. "She's been a nightmare for years," one elderly neighbor confided. "I'm glad someone finally put her in her place." Even those who had previously stayed neutral could no longer defend Karen's actions. She had embarrassed herself beyond repair. Unsurprisingly, Karen couldn't let it go. She began spreading rumors about me, telling anyone who would listen that I was some control freak who stole her car for no reason. Unfortunately for her, the neighborhood had witnessed enough of her antics to know better. Most people rolled their eyes when she started ranting, and some even walked away mid-conversation. Her reputation had taken a serious hit, and she had no one to blame but herself. She also tried petty retaliations, leaving passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox, giving me dirty looks whenever we crossed paths, and even attempting to block my driveway again. But this time, I was ready. I installed a locked gate at the end of my driveway, ensuring she could never park there again. With her last option taken away, Karen had no choice but to accept her defeat. Over the next few weeks, she grew noticeably quieter. She avoided me, avoided my property, and most importantly, stopped parking in my driveway. It was a victory not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. No one had to deal with her entitled behavior anymore. The whole experience had taught me a valuable lesson. Some people only respect consequences, not kindness. I had tried being reasonable, had given Karen more chances than she deserved, but she had refused to listen. Only when she faced real consequences did she finally back down. Looking back, it was absurd that I had to go through all of this just to protect my own driveway. But in the end, it was worth it. Karen learned her lesson the hard way, and the neighborhood was finally free from her entitled antics. And as for my driveway, it remained Karen-free from that day forward. Karen's audacity knew no bounds. Despite countless warnings, discussions, and even the involvement of the police, she continued to treat my driveway as if it were her personal parking space. At this point, I had exhausted all polite solutions. She had ignored the security cameras, laughed at the no parking sign, and disregarded every confrontation and legal warning. Enough was enough. One crisp morning, I stepped outside with my coffee, only to find Karen's car sitting in my driveway once again. My patience had run out. I had been documenting every incident meticulously, ensuring that I had all the proof necessary to take the next step. This time, I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to hit her where it hurt, her wallet. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and called a local tow company. I provided them with my property ownership documents and security footage, confirming that Karen had no permission to park there. The dispatcher assured me that a truck would be there within 30 minutes. I could hardly wait. As I stood at my window, watching the tow truck pull up, I felt a strange sense of justice. The driver took one look at the situation, shook his head knowingly, and got to work. Within minutes, Karen's car was hitched up and being pulled away. I could only imagine her reaction when she found out, and I didn't have to wait long. About an hour later, I heard a furious pounding on my front door. I knew exactly who it was before I even opened it. There stood Karen, her face flushed with anger, eyes blazing, fists clenched at her sides. "Where is my car?" she shrieked, her voice echoing down the street. It started with a single car. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, maybe someone had parked there by mistake, or perhaps it was a temporary situation. But when I walked outside the next morning and saw the same car sitting smugly in my driveway, I felt a twinge of irritation. Who in their right mind would think it's okay to park on someone else's property without permission? This wasn't a shared lot, nor was it street parking. This was my driveway, my personal space, and yet someone had decided that it was now their convenient parking spot. The question was, who? At first, I thought it might be a visitor to one of my neighbors, someone who had mistakenly assumed my driveway was fair game. However, as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my blood pressure rise. The car belonged to my neighbor, Karen. Now, anyone who has ever lived next to a Karen knows exactly what I mean. The entitlement, the lack of consideration, the unshakable belief that the world revolves around them. And in this case, Karen had apparently decided that my driveway was now an extension of her own property. I knocked on her door, determined to resolve this quickly and amicably. When she finally answered, she looked at me like I was inconveniencing her, despite the fact that her car was trespassing on my property. "Oh, that?" she said dismissively, waving a hand toward her car. "I figured it wouldn't be a big deal. I needed the extra space, and your driveway was empty, so I thought, why not?" I blinked. "Because it's my driveway. You can't just park there without asking." Karen rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed with my reasoning. "Come on, it's not like you use it all the time. And besides, it's just a driveway. Why are you making a big deal out of this?" At that moment, I realized that I wasn't dealing with a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't someone who had accidentally parked in the wrong place and was now embarrassed about it. This was someone who genuinely believed that my property was up for grabs because it was convenient for her. "I need you to move your car," I said, trying to remain civil. "This is my property, and I don't want you parking here without permission." She sighed dramatically, as if I were being utterly unreasonable. "Fine," she said, finally agreeing. But she took her time moving her car, making it clear she wasn't happy about it. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I walked outside to find Karen's car parked in my driveway again. At this point, irritation turned to frustration. Clearly, she hadn't taken my words seriously. I knocked on her door again, but this time, she didn't answer. I left a note on her windshield, politely reminding her that this was private property and she needed to move her car. The next morning, I found that note crumpled up and tossed onto my lawn. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop just because I asked her to. She was deliberately ignoring me, acting as if my words had no authority over what happened on my own property. I decided to take a different approach. I installed a no parking private property sign at the edge of my driveway. Maybe a visual reminder would do the trick. Nope. Karen completely disregarded it. She continued to park in my driveway as if my sign were invisible. At this point, I was fed up. If she wasn't going to respect my property, I was going to take stronger measures. I installed a security camera that captured the entire driveway and made sure it recorded everything 24/7. The very next morning, there it was again. Karen's car, parked in my driveway like it belonged there. This time, I had proof. I walked up to her house and knocked. When she opened the door, she had that same exasperated look on her face, as if I were the one bothering her. "Karen, I need you to stop parking in my driveway," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I have security footage of you parking here, and if this continues, I'm going to have to take further action." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you seriously filming me? That's an invasion of privacy." I nearly laughed. "It's my property, Karen. You're the one trespassing. I have every right to record what happens on my own driveway." She scoffed. "You're being so dramatic. It's just a driveway." "Then why don't you use yours?" I shot back. She huffed, clearly out of arguments, and slammed the door. A few minutes later, she moved her car. But I had no doubt in my mind that this wasn't over. Word started getting around the neighborhood. I casually mentioned to a few of my other neighbors what was happening, and to my shock, many of them had similar stories. Karen had a habit of using other people's spaces as if they were public property. Some had dealt with her parking in front of their homes for days on end, blocking access to their mailboxes or driveways. Others had caught her using their front yards as shortcuts when she didn't feel like walking around the block. Realizing that I wasn't alone in dealing with Karen's entitlement made me even more determined to put an end to this nonsense. I spoke to a few of the neighbors, and we agreed to document every instance of Karen's overreach. The next time she parked in my driveway, I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to have undeniable proof of her repeated trespassing. Sure enough, within a few days, Karen parked in my driveway again. This time, I didn't bother knocking on her door. Instead, I called a tow truck. When Karen came outside later that day to find her car missing, she absolutely lost it. She pounded on my door, screaming about how I had stolen her car. I calmly informed her that I had it towed because she had been warned multiple times and she had ignored every single warning. "You had no right," she screeched. "That's theft. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," I said, folding my arms. "I have all the security footage of you repeatedly trespassing on my property. I even have the police report documenting every complaint I've made about this. You were warned." She called the police, but when they arrived and saw the footage, they told her she had no case. If anything, she was the one in the wrong. The tow company wouldn't release her car until she paid the fees, which amounted to several $100s. The look on her face when she realized she had to pay for her own entitlement was priceless. That was the moment Karen finally began to understand. This wasn't just about a driveway. This was about respect, boundaries, and the consequences of entitlement. But was the lesson learned? Not quite. That would come later, when she tried to retaliate in an even pettier way. After the towing incident, any reasonable person would have learned their lesson. Parking in someone else's driveway without permission once was already an egregious offense, but to do it again after being towed? That was another level of audacity. Unfortunately, Karen wasn't a reasonable person. Instead of being embarrassed or deterred, she decided to escalate her behavior in a way that left me stunned. The very next morning, I stepped outside and saw it, her car, once again sitting in my driveway, as if the towing ordeal had never happened. My frustration turned into outright rage. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate, calculated move. I wasted no time knocking on her door, my patience wearing dangerously thin. She answered with an exaggerated yawn, as if I had just rudely interrupted her from a deep sleep. "Oh, it's you again," she said, rubbing her eyes. "What now? Karen, move your car, right now." "I am done with this nonsense." She smirked, crossing her arms. "You already had it towed once. Isn't that enough? What, are you going to tow it every single day now?" "If I have to, yes," I shot back. "This is my property, and you have absolutely no right to be here. If you park here again, I am calling the police. And this time, it won't just be a tow. There will be legal consequences." She rolled her eyes. "You're being ridiculous. It's just a piece of pavement. Why do you care so much?" "Because it's mine," I stated firmly, "and you don't get to decide that my property is up for public use. Move it now." She held my stare for a few seconds before sighing dramatically and slamming the door in my face. A few moments later, she finally moved her car, but not before revving the engine in an act of sheer pettiness. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but Karen wasn't done. Since she knew I would tow her car if she parked in my driveway again, Karen decided to take a more indirect approach. Instead of outright parking on my property, she began parking as close as legally possible to it, right on the curb in front of my house. Every single day, she'd make sure her car was positioned just inches away from my driveway entrance, making it inconvenient for me to pull in or out. If she had guests over, she encouraged them to do the same, lining the street in front of my house with cars, even though there was ample space in front of her own home. It was infuriatingly obvious that she was doing this just to get under my skin. And the worst part? Technically, it wasn't illegal. I decided to take a different approach. I reached out to my other neighbors, explaining what had been happening. To my surprise, several of them had their own stories about Karen's entitled behavior. One neighbor told me how she had blocked their mailbox multiple times, preventing them from getting their mail delivered. Another said she would let her guests take up multiple parking spots for no reason, forcing other residents to park far from their own homes. Realizing that Karen had made a habit of treating the entire neighborhood like her personal playground, I decided to escalate things. I researched my city's parking laws and found something interesting. While Karen wasn't technically breaking any laws by parking in front of my house, repeated nuisance behavior could be considered harassment under certain ordinances. I started documenting everything, taking photos of her car each day, noting the times, and keeping track of her guests who deliberately blocked my driveway. Once I had gathered enough evidence, I filed a formal complaint with the local authorities. I also called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. To my relief, the police took my complaint seriously. They visited Karen's house and issued her a warning, letting her know that if she continued to engage in targeted nuisance behavior, she could face fines. Karen, of course, was livid. She stormed over to my house the next day, banging on my door as if she had the right to be the victim in this situation. "You're turning the whole neighborhood against me," she yelled the moment I opened the door. "No, Karen," I said, staying as calm as possible. "You did that to yourself." She ranted about how unfair it was, about how I was ruining her life over just parking, but I wasn't interested in listening anymore. I shut the door in her face, leaving her fuming on my porch. But Karen wasn't done. A few days later, I woke up, got ready for work, and stepped outside, only to find Karen's car not just parked near my driveway, but completely blocking it. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an outright act of defiance.